Mike Goldstein is back for another video interview where we talk about what comes next after the Scientology bridge and what he decided to do with his mentor, John Galusha, called Idenics. And we go into detail regarding that. I think you'll find it interesting. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our channel, Scientology Peeling the Onion. My name is Mark Fisher, and I'm here with my co-host, Janice Gillum-Grady. Hi, Janice. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. G'day, Mark. G'day, everybody. And I hope everybody's having a good day.
That's right. That's right. We had a little bit of computer problems, but we got them fixed and sorted out so we can do this show and all that. But
that's why I don't have the Aussie background right now.
It's all right. You still look good, Janice. We all appreciate that fact. Well, anyway, so we've got our returning guest again, Mike Goldstein. We've done lots of shows with him, and we're going to carry on with where we left off about where do we go from here after doing the Scientology bridge and that type of thing, independent Scientology, outside of Scientology, and all that. And he was talking about what he decided to do with his group and John Galusha. And we're going to bring him back on to answer some questions and also talk more about that. Okay?
Good. Yep.
All right. So without further ado, here he is, Mike Goldstein. Hey, Mike, how you doing today?
Good. How you guys doing?
Doing
great. Doing great. Good. Yeah. So you wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about what where we ended off on creative processing and stuff on the last video, right?
Yes, because there've been a lot of comments and questions and on the video and also to my website. People have been asking questions. There were some confusions, I guess, when I was talking about it. So I thought I would clear that first.
Okay.
Because we had talked about, and plus it kind of summarizes what we were talking about at the end of the last video, which was where do we go from here? And I talked a little bit about directions other people were going and the directions that some of the people, the technical people at Survival Services were going. And then we ended up going one direction with John Galusha. That was the one that was with creative processing. And there were some confusions about that. So I figured I'll clean that up first. Because a lot of what you read in the comments here and a lot of the questions were dealing with creative processing, something that I was calling evaluative delivery. Okay. And I didn't really clarify that enough. Okay. In other words, we were doing creative processing, but we weren't. Actually, it was John that was doing the creative processing, something that he had been doing in the 50s with Hubbard. And in those days, there were many different forms of creative processing. And all of the ones that I've been reading about on the comments and people have been asking me about, and the ones in the books like History of Man and Scientology 88008, those were what I would call evaluative applications of creative processing.
Are you saying evaluative?
Evaluate, where they're evaluating. And what I meant by that, that's what I want to define. It's where you're getting, as we talked about, creative processing was also called mock-up processing. And mock-ups were making a picture, creating something like that.
Right.
And if you were getting somebody to mock up anything other than if you're getting a client to mock up anything other than what that PC was stating or seeing, that was evaluative.
Mike, explain mock-ups for people who never. What does that mean? Mock-up. It's like mock up an apple. So you think of an apple,
or make a picture of it. Really, that kind of a thing. You're making a picture of something. That's what.
You create the thought in your mind.
Right. Like
it's just a term that we used in Scientology, mock-up.
Yeah.
I don't know if people know
but
that.
It's more. It's something that later we're calling was something else. It was like making a picture. It was envisioning, envisioning something. That's a better word than I think than mock. But it's that sort of thing. So if you're giving people ideas of this is, a lot of the information on the doctor tapes was very evaluative. It was like, well, this is what is causing your problems, and this is what you need to imagine, and this is what happened in the universe. All that is evaluative. It's not coming from the client. It's coming from somebody else's ideas about things. In those cases, Hubbard. And that, so when people went back and they started trying to figure out where do we go from here, and they started listening to the Philadelphia doctor tapes and looking at some of this stuff, then that's what they were getting. Okay, because most of those processes were that way. It was his idea of what people should be mocking up, you understand, should be envisioning, because these were his ideas of what was wrong with people, what was going on, what was happening in the universe, that sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of one size fits all, right? In other words, if you're doing something, I got this, it's going to work for everybody, but it may not necessarily work for everybody.
Well, that's a lot of Scientology. I'm sorry, a lot of the bridge is that this. If you do this, this will happen. To everybody. This is the same thing that this incident happened to everybody in this. Okay, and even if it did, so what? People respond differently. Right. It's not like everybody responded the same way. No two people in life respond the same way. How does everybody in one sector of the universe respond the same? Things like that. So in other words,
are you saying that that's very different to Scientology technology, where it said you have to apply it exactly for it to work?
Right. But it didn't. Even though that was said that way, it didn't work out that way. You talk about, well, this works 100% of the time. It didn't. It just didn't. I'm sorry. It just was not like that. I mean, people did the bridge. Did they get wins? Was it workable? Yes. But there wasn't much that it was the same for everybody. Okay. In other words, you did these processes, and somebody maybe started somewhere was on the bridge, and they were what Hubbard used to call digging the ditch. They buy their 100 hours, they'd be going through their grades, and then some particular process might hit the guy right where he lives, and just the guy blows out, just hits him right. There's the right question at the right time. Now that same question might not work for anybody else that way, or him again. It just happened to work for them at that time. And then you couldn't even take a guy back in a session like that. I mean, he was just floating, and then they'd just make up, would you like to declare to clear OT? Oh, okay. They give him something to declare to, but it wasn't standard. It just happened to hit him. So a lot of what, in my view, of what Scientology was, is the shotgun technique. You fire enough shot at somebody and you're bound to hit them where they live once in a while. A lot of that was the bridge. But back in the early days, before the bridge, before he started putting the bridge in, you were still working with that sort of thing with the processes, and the creative processing. There was a very basic idea of what creative processing was, which was very simple. If you get the PC to mock up what they're mocking up compulsively on purpose, get them mocking it up on purpose, what's being done compulsively, that should handle it. That was the basic idea, and which was very simple and very beautiful in some ways, right? But then, if you're talking about in that description, what is the guy mocking up? Well, you got to ask him. It's like, in other words, this is what's going on with the person. So, and you're saying if this is something he's mocking up compulsively, well, what is that? But when you get into processes defining what the person should mock up, or, well, but the real reason you have this is this, and this is what you need to do because then there's this, that's not coming from them. That's not coming from the client. It's coming from somebody else's mind of what they should do. Hubbard's in most cases. Okay. So when I read all those comments, a lot of well, this is this, and yes, I know those are very evaluative type of creative processes. In other words, you're anything other than what the person is compulsively mocking up, and telling you this is what's going on, it's not coming from that person. And to say, and people, that was based on there was actually a Philadelphia doctor tape I mentioned before called The Goals of an Auditor, which changed everything that had been going on with, say, Dianetics. In Dianetics, you took up, and this is important because it has everything to do with what we're going to be talking about. In Dianetics, you only took up what the person wanted to handle or resolve or change in his life or improve in his life. In other words, this was his condition or her condition. That was theirs. And that's all you would take up with Dianetics. But Hubbard decided 2 years later that they don't know what they should take up. They're just banks. So we have to figure it out for him. And that's basically what he states in that tape, The Goals of an Auditor, lecturing them. So obviously the creative processes that were being talked about on those tapes and generally done were that sort of things where the auditors would figure out what it was that the guy should take up based on things and concepts that Hubbard was providing. Okay. Well, at that point, John did not do that. I mean, he did some of it, obviously, but his idea was to apply that concept to what it was going on with that PC. All right. In other words, there was no evaluation. It was based on the same idea as Dianetics, which I'm going to take up what the guy wants to work on, without an idea of how he should work on it or what's behind it. You understand? So the pure mock-up or creative processing went something like this. Guy says, he said, what do you want to work on? Well, I have a Zorch in my banana. It's coming out of my ear. Okay. All right, good. Well, what I want you to do is get a picture of yourself with a Zorch in your banana coming out of your ear. Good. Now put that picture up outside you a little distance. Good. And then make a copy. In other words, then you would be running the process, but based on what the guy said. It didn't have to make sense. It made sense to him. It's what it was. You don't figure that out. And that was something that people didn't do. Okay. But John did.
Let me ask you a question, okay? Because I just thought about this. I mean, we all have had Scientology auditing. I agree with you. In other words, with Dianetics, it's like take up what the person wants to handle, right? But it seemed like Hubbard at some point decided that wasn't good enough, and then so you would list off a bunch of things that, oh yeah, my apple, my this and that, but then he would rely on the e-meter to see what read in order for them to address that, rather than, oh no, I got this banana in my Zorch, apple's reading, that's what we're going to handle, right?
And this is before the meter. This is still before.
Well, I know. I'm talking about later, though. I'm talking
later,
about later.
yeah.
In other words, he became more relying on what the meter told the auditor rather than what the person said, right?
Exactly. Yeah. What the meter said. But there was also a lot of evaluation in terms of the meter, like what this read means, and this read means that, and this data means that, all these different evaluative ideas about the reads of the meter. When
slam.
Yeah, that would mean even. And then how many people went to the RPF and then later were taken out because people didn't know how to read the meter or whatever? Hello. So it was just silliness, but yet the basic meter didn't work. Yes, the meter had workability. It really did, and it had workability in that it somehow registered thought. Now, how that, before you get into all these LRH explanations for it, well, it's mental mass. He didn't know this. These were his explanations. It somehow registered thought. It did. And it worked with in a way that you had a flow going through, a little tiny electrical flow, and it somehow went out. And it worked that way. You could test it with the pinch test. But all these other reads and what they meant and all that was all piled up on top of it. Okay. So, and it's very interesting because once I'll talk about that a little later if you want, because once we started doing Idenics, we used a meter at first, but not in the same.
You don't use it anymore?
No, not since 1992. but we did for a couple, or 91 or something. We did for a couple of years, but it was, and the only way that meter was used in those days, because John, I think, he was the best meter. He was around back when Mathis invented them. And so he was in on all the research of the meters, and just, it's like another, it was like an extension of his arm. But when we started doing Idenics, we didn't use it the same way. All it was used for was as a steering device. That was
Right.
it. Just so if the guy's looking at something, you could, and you see a particular read, whatever you're looking at, take a good look. Yeah, that. Oh, that's all. And we found in the beginning when we were using it that if a practitioner understood what, the Idenic, understood what they were doing and knew how to read a meter, then it could save a client about 10 minutes in the hour. That was it. It saved 10 minutes to the guy. It wasn't that necessary, but if it saved him 10 minutes, that's why we used it. And then a couple of years later, with advancements in the subject, it was just getting in the way. So John said, forget, we don't need this thing. It was faster. You're not using it. It wasn't saving any time. It just got in the way. So that's when we tossed that. But yeah.
Yeah, I want to do a little bit of establishment here, just so that our viewers and everything know exactly what we're talking about here. I read your book this week, Idenics. This is the book you wrote a few years ago covering this subject. And before we get into theory about it, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the mechanics of how you set up the group and how did it all start? I know that John wanted to do this creative processing, John Galusha, and you thought that was a good direction to go. So did you guys set up an organization? Like, how did this all start?
Well, we were already set up as survival services. I started that company with the book one with Diana. I started the company, and then we went on to deliver everything. And now we going on to the next, where do you go from here? And we ended up going this direction with the creative processing. And we were doing the creative processing. John, when Hubbard put creative processing on a back burner in the 50s and said, yeah, this is too high level processing, we need to go in on gradients. And he started the bridge. That was the whole, at the point was, this is why we're doing the bridge, because this is too high level. We need to come on gradients. And at the time when he put it on the back burner, John said, okay, that may be, but the style of creative processing that I'm doing, which is I just explained, I'm not having the same problems you are with that. And it's limited, but yet it's limited how well it works past a certain point. But yet it's still going well in certain cases, and I'm going to continue to do it. And Hubbard said, oh, okay, and John continued to work with it over the years. Like I mentioned in other podcasts, he did it on me when I was on my knots and couldn't get the flag. Right. And when I was there, it was the greatest session I ever had. But it was still, he didn't use it all the time in those days. But but where we decided as a next step, this is what he felt he wanted to put in. In other words, once a person had finished all of their up through OT7 or advanced level 7, all that stuff, and done everything on the bridge, and they were done, where do you go from here? That's the people that I started bringing in for him to work with on this creative processing that he'd been developing for all these years.
That became your upper OT levels.
Well, we weren't calling it anything. It was just we just doing that after people that were completed.
So you didn't do it on new people. You only
not at
did
first. Not at first, because what we were doing was the same thing Captain Bill was doing, and David Mayer. We're looking for the next step. Where do you go from here?
Right.
When we started, this is where John felt. In other words, Hubbard had tried to put creative processing back in after OT3. In other words, in a way, he felt that maybe after OT3, people could now, that was enough gradients to put this in, but he put it in level form. And those were your old OT levels, 4 through 7, were based on the positive gains processing or creative processing that he was doing. That's kind of how he did it. In fact, I remember, and I mentioned this before, John said when he went out to AO and they give him those levels, he said, I did this stuff in the 50s. Oh, well, then just declare. You know, that was what they said. It was stuff that pretty much everything on the existing bridge was researched in some way in the 50s, including ET and clusters, all that stuff.
So you and John decided to try this direction or go in this direction.
This is the direction we went.
So did you just decide, like Janice is asking, did you at first you were just doing this on people who were OT7 or whatever?
Only people that had finished everything. That's it. Meanwhile, other people at the survival service were still delivering the other stuff.
Got it. And then was it just John delivering it? Did he teach you, or how did that work?
Well, he did, but he did. But pretty much it was him just doing the delivery. I wasn't delivering to the public. I mean, I could do it, but I was just delivering to them. I was doing my job at the time. So it was, people were coming. They wanted it from him anyway. You wanted it from John Galusha. So and plus you wanted the best doing it. And so that's how we pilot. So what we found was that that's pretty much only people we were working with. And these were people that had finished everything. But what happened was, and one of the reasons, like I mentioned before, why he did it because it past a certain point, people would bog down. It would only go a certain distance. In other words, it wasn't something that you could just keep doing on people. And that happened. But he figured maybe now that these people have finished all this stuff on the bridge, let's see if this will work. Because the idea is if you're handling what the person wants to take up, what else should there be?
Yeah, I got that from the beginning part of the reading the book, and also what you've been talking about here, which is that you basically are handling what it is that the person wants handled, not what they're telling you need to handle.
Right.
It's and what it's your girlfriend, your children, your attitude at work, whatever it is that the person, you address that and handle that, as opposed to, oh no, you've got to do your next step on the bridge, right?
Right. And this is before Idenics, you understand. This is just the creative.
I understand, but that's basically what you're trying to do.
Exactly. So what happened though is these OT7s or guys that have finished their OT levels and their L's and everything, they started past a certain point bogging also, even though they got good wins, but past a certain point, it didn't work. And basically it was the same phenomena that happened in the 50s. It's the same phenomena that happened in the late 60s. And so it was like, but during this time and over the years, John had been had clues to certain things, which I'll get into. I mean, just different little things. Some of these things that he was coming up with were back in the 50s when he was researching with Hubbard. In fact, even one of the things I'll talk about a little later was something Hubbard even wrote up in a PAB and mentioned, but they couldn't figure out where it fit. John just kind of put that on a back burner until Idenics. A lot of this stuff, and he was coming up with stuff in the 1981 when we were doing, but it was like, how does this all fit together? And while we were doing this creative processing on these people, it all started to click. It all started to fit together for him. And when it did, all of a sudden, it was like we're into a different subject now. In other words, this isn't the same thing. The first kind of realization for him of that was, well, Hubbard's why the creative processing wasn't working was he had to come. It was because it was too high level and you had to come in on gradients, therefore the bridge. But John realized that's not true. And which was the kind of the beginnings of Idenics was that it's not gradients. It just depends on what identity the person is in when you're auditing them. Since they're all limited, once you run into those limitations, that no matter how good the process is, that's as far as it goes. So from there, he started putting it together, which was the beginnings of what we now call Idenics. Okay, we just called it, like I said at the time, identity processing. But we started working, the first people he started working with when he had some of these basic concepts and basic processes together, which was right after that point, was he started working with the people that had finished everything, okay, to see how this works. And they cleaned up really nice. And they started doing well to the point of whatever they wanted to work on was handled to the point where they just going, yeah, I'm fine now. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go back to Miami or whatever it was, because we'd have people come in from all over the country since I had those communication lines with people. And
let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, okay,
yeah.
without getting into the exact processes you run or whatever it is you do with Idenics or whatever, but just the actual procedure of the whole thing. So you, at the time, you said you used a meter, but then in 92 or whatever,
that was later. Yeah.
But you later dropped it. But basically, is it just sort of like a one-on-one counseling session with an Idenics?
I'm sorry, it is. It's one-on-one, the same as auditing. It's one-on-one, okay? Except the application, the philosophy is 180 degrees, okay, which I'll explain. But the mechanics, yeah.
But hold on, so it's one-on-one. So here was my question I was going to ask. So it's one-on-one, and the person says, "I want to handle my apple." I'm just using it as an example.
Right.
So you go in and you're in a session, and the person's dealing or talking about the apple or whatever he's doing about it.
Yeah.
At what point do you know that, okay, this is a good point to end off, or he's handled his apple? Was there like an end phenomena, like there is in Scientology, where you go, oh, you have to have this end phenomena? You know what I mean?
Not different. Okay. See, one of the things, I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I'll answer the question.
No, but I'm just talking about the general concept. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, in as you know, in Scientology, there was always kind of an end phenomena, FN, VGIs, floating needle, that kind
Cognition,
of stuff.
Yeah.
Cognition, COG, FN, VGI. Okay. Well, how many people did you know that got overrun? They even had process. I mean, you had special rundowns for overrun that you would take.
That's correct.
Rehab.
Yeah.
We called rehab, where you take the guy in and you'd rehab. Yeah. I remember the first auditing I did on the ship in the RPF was with my PC was rehabs. We'd been overrun on something, and I had to take her, and I mentioned and had to do that. But the point is that happened all the time because you had this rote end phenomena for everybody, right? And what happened, and it's like if you go, the way I look at it is this way. To talk about it a little differently, I'm going to try to take every session I do to what I call a good point. And what a good point is going to be different from person to person, session to session. All I know is that you go past that point and things tend to grind, which is what they called overrun, right?
Right.
And then you have to go fix that, right? So you don't do it. You take each session to that point. How do I know? I asked the guy. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years, so I get a pretty good idea based on what he's saying that maybe we hit something. And I ask him, "How are you doing? Is this maybe a good point to end this session?" "Yeah, I think so." And some of them end off where the guy's like, "Oh, blown away," VGIs, like they used to say. And sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it's like, I feel okay about that. Yeah.
So you take him to a good point in that session, but he may not have fully handled his apple. So then you go in the next session and you go into the next thing. Right?
Well, but
and then and at the very end of it, is it like, hey man, the apple's not bothering me anymore? Is that
it goes as it goes. It's like a lot of times you're going to take the session and you do have that thing where the apple is handled in that session. Sometimes you hit a good point and the person's not sure. I just feel, I feel pretty good. I want to end off. He doesn't know maybe life's the proving ground. He's got to go out and see. And then sometimes what happens is the guy spots something on his own before the next session and handles it, right? In other words, when I'm doing in Idenics, we're not programming people for what they're going to do. I don't even think about what I'm going to do in the next session. I mean, let alone what they do in Scientology with, CS and programming guy. People change, okay? I mean, from moment to moment, how do I know? And so I'm only working with a client in the moment, in that moment, all right? Because things are different. Like say if I start working with the guy and I say, "What do you want to work on?" And he gives me a list of 10 things. Okay. What do I do? Well, I find out of those 10 things, what's the most important to take up first, because I can't take them all up at once. So once that's determined, which doesn't take that long usually. Once he settles on the thing, that's what I want to take up. You take that up. Now you say you take that up and it resolves and you end the session, right? Now I still got these other 9 items, as they used to say, right? But when I go into the next session, I don't automatically go, okay, we got 9 more things here. No, the only thing I'm ever going to ask that guy in the next session is, what do you want to work on today? If he asks me to read the list, I have it, but I'll never mention it.
Right.
Because sometimes the guy else, you look at the list and the guy goes, what list? The other 9 items were the same thing stated differently or somehow connected to the thing you handled. And now he's interested in something else. See? Or sometimes, here's another example of that. Say I'm working with somebody, it was a little late and the guy's so tired, he just doesn't want, so it's silly to continue. So we take a break. We haven't necessarily ended a good point because he's too tired, he's exhausted. Okay, we'll just we'll pick it up in the morning, right? So I stay up all night figuring out, oh God, what am I going to do with the guy the next day? And we go in a session and somehow the guy spotted something during the night and the rest of it's gone and he wants to handle something else. Stayed up all night, waste of time. Only by the moment, only work with somebody. So
let me ask you another practical question. Let's say you're talking to somebody about his apple, and all of a sudden, as we used to say in Scientology, he gets really keyed in about the apple, and he's really upset and like not feeling good and this and that. I mean, is there a way that you can handle that, a technique, or is that you just keep going until you get him to a good point, or how does that work?
Yeah, it usually works out fine. I don't usually.
So it's the same as what turns it on, turns it off?
Well, kind of. It's like I'm always going to follow the guy. See, that's the difference. I'm following this person. In other words, and this is something pretty important because one of the things we found once we started doing this new process with people is that, like I said, the first people we were working with were people that had finished everything, right? And and John was working with these guys with the basics, beginnings of identity,
right?
And they would just do fine. They get to a point where I'm ready to go home. They're doing great. So then we had people calling us who had not finished their knots. They were in the middle of their knots, okay? And they wanted to come and do some of this stuff. And so, okay, we're still researching. Let's see how it goes. And some of those guys were what we used to call in knots over-stim cases. And what that was in the knots was somebody supposedly they had too many of these guys woken up, too many BTs woke up, and they were overwhelmed. And the only knots handling for you go have the guy destimulate by looking at a rock or taking a walk, and then you take him into session and gently take up one area at a time. Right? That was the thing. Well, we got a couple of these guys coming to us over stim cases. They handled like breezes with the Idenics, right? Now, what was happening there? Well, I can only tell you what some of them said. Do I know this is the case? No. But one of some of those people that were very much into the whole thing about knots, their whole thing was, what I would hear from them was, because after a while, you'd work with them with the Idenics, then you didn't hear about the knot stuff anymore, right? Even on the overstim. And what a lot of them would say is, well, they were attached to the identity. I handle the identity, and I don't have these anymore. I don't know what, but all I know is that some of those guys would have some problem, and they'd go down the flag, and they'd get knots on it, and then they'd feel better. Then they got home, and then they'd supposedly accumulate more and go back. Didn't happen with this. They would just, once we were through, it would handle it for them. Right. And you wouldn't hear about the BTs anymore. You just wouldn't.
And you were using the e-meter at this time?
At this time, he was using a meter.
Okay.
But like I said, he wasn't using it the same way. He was only using it as a steering device. That he wasn't in the weeds. He wasn't paying attention. Yeah, if you get, in other words, you got a read that's a little blow down like this, you get the same read, whatever you're looking at, take a good look.
Yeah, it's like a tool.
It's a steering device. That's all he used it for. None of that other stuff. That was it. in those days. And like I said,
so basically, you would do these sessions, and the person would go like, "Oh yeah, I'm not even. I've handled that, or I've had whatever win."
Exactly.
And then, if they didn't have anything else they wanted to handle, then they basically were done. Or if they had more and they wanted to come back later, they could do it, right?
They do it, yeah. I mean, in other words, in those days, the same now. It's like we weren't working with any agenda other than the clients. Right. Which was what they were doing. He was doing creative processing. What he was doing with Idenics also. You know,
I was going to say that's one of the things I noticed in the book, and then also you keep saying it too, is that you don't call them pre-clues, you call them clients. You know what I mean? It's like there's no religious aspect to it. Is there?
No. It's a business. You know, we're not. I don't call them patients.
It's like self-help. It's like it's an alternative to counseling, as you say. An alternative to therapy.
That's the name of the book, an alternative to therapy. Yeah. And when I talk about therapy, I'm talking about not just traditional therapy, but alternative therapies like auditing. Okay.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because Janice and I and Terry and we all talked about this, you know, over the years. Of like, if we ever had to go in and reorganize Scientology, what would we do? Make it a self-help thing, not a church. You know what I mean? In other words, the things that actually work, that we felt worked, deliver those in seminars or whatever, and let people go have their wins and stuff. None of this OT OT ability type stuff. Just do the stuff that actually works, and they would be a lot more successful than they are today. Talking about BTs and clusters and you know what I mean. And it's kind of like, it seems like that's kind of the direction you took. It's not an actual religious type of thing. It's more of like it's a therapy. It's a way of helping people with their problems.
Even a therapy. I don't even include it as therapy. It's just Idenics.
But it's a way of helping them with whatever it is that's bothering them.
What I approach is a facilitation. The difference, big difference between, say, Idenics and therapy, including alternative therapies like auditing, is that there's in therapy, you have the altitude is always with the therapist. The auditor, the CS, that's the altitude. They know you don't. You know, they're going to figure you out. They're going to figure out, because you can't know. You're just kind of buried. You're just a bank or whatever. So in other words, that's where the altitude is. It's sort of like they're leading you. Well, the difference in Idenics is they're leading me. It's kind of like I'm not leading them. I don't know. You see, what it is it's based on you can say it's based on a very old philosophy. It's been around for ages and given lots of lip service, but virtually zero application, which is that people are unique and different, and the answers they seek about themselves is within them. It's not a new philosophy. Most people would agree with it, but where has it ever been applied? Because everywhere you go, somebody's got answers for you with self-improvement. You know, well, this is what you need to do, or we figured this out, and this is they got answers for you. But if you're unique and different, how do they know?
Right.
How do any of them know these things? You see what I'm saying? They don't. It's something that John started, later called pretended knowingness. he just, that was his term for it, just pretended knowingness. It's not.
Yeah.
It's
like labels, like you're bipolar or you're this
or whatever. The point is that it's kind of like this. Here's this person, they're walking down on a dark path. I'm not in front of them. I'm behind them. I got a flashlight. I'm just shining it, and have a look there. Have a look there. Have a look. They see something. They see something. Oh, I'm following them though. They're not following me. The altitude is with them. I didn't live their life. How do I know any of this stuff? So I'm just a facilitator in that whole process. Okay.
Now you have a whole operation going, still delivering this, though John is no longer around, right?
Yeah, he died 30 years ago. So I've been on my own, for 30 years. But at that time, just to kind of get back to what we were talking about, I don't know. Should we just continue?
Oh yeah, no, I had some more questions.
That's okay.
But yeah,
sure. Yeah, but it's been 30 years since he passed away, and so I've kind of been doing it and delivering on my own.
So you had success with this, with people who had finished their bridge or whatever, and then at some point you decided to go and deal with people who had never done any Scientology auditing, right?
Exactly. But because kind of like we first started, like I was saying, these were people that came to us who were still on their knots. Then after that, some of these people were, they were on different parts of the bridge, some of the non-interference zone, where you weren't supposed to do anything other than from clearing the OT3. But they all handled fine too. Then we were working with people that hardly did it, just their grades. So and I mentioned this before, which is kind of I mentioned it. We found something that was more of what I called at the time an undercut. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that we didn't need any of this other stuff anymore. In other words, the idea that people had to go do these sequence of steps and had to do this, it just kind of made that obsolete. Okay, it's not that what we were doing before, like say Dianetics, it's not that I'd ever say that it was not workable. It was workable, but it was obsolete to us at that point, because what we could get done with somebody in a very short period of time compared to years, and then plus you also had the problem of other stuff piled on top of them, other ideas foisted on them, right? That weren't necessarily the way it really was. They just kind of bought into it. So when you talk, I mean, yes, one of the things with Dianetics, there was the thing that we don't evaluate for people, that unlike therapy, because a therapist could say the reason you have this problem is because you hated your mother, and then the Scientologist, we'd laugh at that. Okay, that was a step. That was like a mini step, but it didn't mean that the auditor wasn't evaluating for the PC in his head. Didn't mean that the CS doesn't evaluate. Doesn't mean that the bridge itself is extremely evaluative. It just meant that the auditor is not verbally evaluating for a PC in session. That's all.
Right.
It's a small step, and not all therapists do that anyway. So I'm just saying, it's like when I'm talking not evaluate, I'm talking about completely taking the person. It was a whole different approach that kind of was based on this, and that was the kind of approach we took. But when we first started, at that point we started working with people that were anywhere on the bridge, and then people had never had any Scientology, and it all worked. So it made this other stuff not necessary. Okay. In other words,
let me ask you a question, because this is the question I wanted to about people who had never done any Scientology or any whatever. How when you're dealing with people who had done the Scientology bridge, that you had their cooperation to come in and do this session and to be willing to look and to answer your questions and to do the procedure, right? But what about somebody who was just never had done anything like that at all? How did you get them to be willing to communicate to you? Because I've had friends over the years where I've delved into a subject, and as soon as you hit that subject, they want to bolt. They leave the room, or you know what I mean? It's like, it's difficult. Like, I'm not telling you that, and then they just go. How did you get the new people to really, focus in and cooperate on it?
The same. I never had a problem with it, really. John didn't either. It's like,
well, you know what I'm talking about. In other words, they've got to be willing to be there, right?
Well, it's interesting, because one of the things you're mentioning here is what we used to call withholds, right? And that's kind of what I think you're asking about, because a lot of the people in Scientology, well, they knew they had to. What if somebody got into a subject they didn't want to talk about? Is that what you're talking about?
Emotionally painful, let's say. You know what I mean? Something that they blocked off for years. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. But I don't really have that kind of. I haven't had that kind of a problem with people that were in. In fact, sometimes they were a lot easier to work with than people that have been involved with Scientology, because they had all these fixed ideas about certain things.
Right.
Okay. Which sometimes made it difficult. So it's all an individual matter. It just depends on the person. But one of the things that you were talking, if you were talking about something that the person didn't want to, really talk about, and in Scientology, you had to get them to talk about it, right? You had to pull that withhold, right? For example, that was something that was a big deal, right? Not in Idenics, but in Scientology, right?
Right.
I mean, withhold pulling was a big thing. If the guy didn't give his withhold up, there were techniques for how to do that sort of thing, right?
That's right.
You had to get that kind of stuff. Well, one of the beauties in Idenics is I never have that problem, ever. Why? Because part of the problem with the whole withhold was created by putting the guys that kind of tension on it. All right. Putting their attention on that they have to. And so a lot of times as an auditor, you had to go in a session and listen to the same kind of withholds over and over and over, because oh yeah. And it had nothing to do with the session, but you had to listen to all the masturbation withholds. I'm sorry, but you know what I'm talking about. It's just because the guy had to be able to tell him, Well, when I would in what I'm doing, the main thing that the person has to do is look, not that they tell me, because I'm not basing what I'm doing based on evaluating what they're saying,
right,
and what it means. You understand? It's a whole matter, like you read in the book, of getting the guy to look. And that's the first thing I go over with people is compare difference between thinking and looking. But in terms of the withhold thing, well, I've had that. You work with somebody. I remember, a businesswoman from Houston, and she came up and she was like, we got in a session and she said, well, I don't want to tell you that. Right? Okay. I mean, I could guess what it was, right? Obviously, it had something to do with sex. But anyway, at the time, but I said, well, you've spotted it. You know what that is? Well, yeah, of course I do. I just want to. That's fine. The main thing is that you look, not that you tell me. Okay.
Right.
Well, you've looked at that? Yeah, well, then that's fine. And you could just see the person go, oh, But so what? Did you look? Did you? Yes. And I just got on with it. If I need to know how much you tell me, I tell them too. How much you tell me is up to you. Right. I've heard everything. You can tell me whatever you want, but if how much you tell me in verbal is up to you. If I need to know something, I'll ask. And I've had clients that go through sessions. I don't even know what they're looking at, because a lot of the answers are Not necessarily because they're withholding, they don't want to tell me, but just because it's faster for them. Okay. You see what I'm saying?
Does somebody who's delivering this, do they have to keep, how we used to have worksheets in Scientology? Do you have to take notes, or
I do,
keep track of where you're at, or what?
To some degree, not because I'm not using those in any, I don't have to send them to a case supervisor to figure out. And I don't go back through them and just, and figure what I'm going to do based on it. I mean, in other words, all I'm writing down, the main things I'm writing down when I do it, in other words, in Scientology, you couldn't see your own PC folders, right?
Right.
There's so much evaluation in there, it could cave a person in. Point is, a person wants to see their stuff here. I don't care. You look at it. It's just I don't care. It's just what they said. In other words, all I'm putting down is, okay, I want to put down the start of the session and the end so I can keep track of the time. Right. Sometime, and I don't even do much of this anymore because I know it so well, but used to be, I just kind of make a note so I knew where I was at in a procedure, or that sort of thing. And I would, and the other things I was writing down, the main thing is what the person's unwanted conditions were, what it is. Because like when I start a session and I ask the person, what do you want to work on? Especially in the beginning, sometimes you get a whole spew of all this stuff. Well, there's this, and then I was in, they did this on me, and you're getting more than just the unwanted condition. You're getting other people's evaluation, what they've been through, all this other stuff. And then you might be. So this is a period which is sometimes before I even get what it is they want to handle, is very therapeutic for the guy, because just being able to, something nice like draining a cesspool. Just let it all come out. Just let it, anything else, just to list. So there's nothing else that they want to say about it. And that in itself is like, people are, wow. But what am I looking for? I want to find out where we're going to start. So I'm not necessarily writing down all this stuff they're saying. I'm listening for the unwanted conditions. well, and they said, but I need to, but I really hate getting angry. But then, oh, okay. So I'm just writing it in their words, what those things are. It's kind of like you have like when you're panning, you're gonna have one of those things, a sleuth with looking for gold nuggets, and you're going through all this stuff. I'm looking for the gold nuggets and all that stuff, which are those conditions the person's saying. And when they're all done, I might have several different things here, right? Sometimes I ask a person, what do you want to handle? Boom, it's one thing and away we go. Sometimes they list off several things. Sometimes it's like what I just said, and I have to listen for them. And if I'm evaluating, I don't hear them. You understand? New practitioners sometimes don't hear because they got too much going on in their own head.
Right.
So you then, without getting into the processes or whatever the procedures, you would then ask as a if you were the counselor, you would ask questions or give them a command of some sort, and then you would acknowledge whatever they say. Like, it's a communication formula like that we talk about in Scientology. Is that important as well?
Yes, to some degree.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though there are certain things that I don't do that we did in the communication formula.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain things like acknowledgments. It's a different kind. It's like okay. Go ahead, Janice. I'm sorry.
So you don't do any Scientology stuff now. You just take these people and you just run them through your own processes.
Yeah, exactly. And I wish I could get into a couple basic stuff.
Let me ask you another practical question, because, and just so I can end that part off. So basically John started and did this and all that, but then obviously you had to train other people, right? So then did he or you develop then a course to teach other people to become counselors?
Yes. But at that time when he was starting, he didn't have enough material to be able to teach somebody. He was kind of just doing it. And it's interesting because there's the way that Idenics was researched was not the way Scientology was researched. He did not research the same way as Hubbard. Okay, the way Hubbard researched, for instance, was if he or one of his auditors got a result that he approved of, it became a piece of the standard technology.
Right.
Everybody did it. It could be just something that he thought up himself. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's how he read. You have so many different processes. He got these. How did he get them all? He thought up a lot of them. He would come up with a concept and then develop processes around it. For instance, I can give you lots of examples. I'll give you a real one if you want to hear one. It's a great story, actually. I remember that John telling me this. This is back in the 50s, and when Millie Galusha, who was Millie Dean at that time, but then she became Millie Galusha, and she was LRH's secretary in D.C. And she asked him for a session once, and he gave her a session, and said, "Well, why don't we co-audit? Well, you audit me, I'll audit you." She okay, she was a trained auditor, so she takes him into session, and he took up this something about the war, and she starts working with him, and he immediately says, "Who taught you to audit? You're the worst auditor I've ever seen. You are so bad. You are terrible." And he just started grinding her into the ground to the point where she ended the session in tears. Right. So John was on a mission in New Orleans at the time where Hubbard sent him to work with some rich people down there or something. And she called John up. "Oh, I don't know what to do." And John said to her, he says, the only advice he gave her, he says, "You take that PC back into session and I'll send you a dozen roses." That was it. So she went and she collared Hubbard, as John used to say, and got him back in, which he was kicking and screaming. "Oh, she takes him back in, and he's going, I don't know why I'm in here. You're the worst auditor." And she just didn't, she didn't know what to do. They just had processes they pulled out of a barrel in those days.
Right.
And the only thing that came to her mind was, "How can I help you?" "Well, you couldn't help me tie my shoe." But she got an answer. She was a good auditor. She got an answer to her question. So she just did it repetitively. "Thank you. How can I help you?" Well, maybe you can help me tie my shoe, but not much more than that. Thank you. How can I help you? And he had a pretty good session. And the next day he came out with 4 flow health process. You see? Based on his session, one person, he came out with the whole 4 flow health processing based on that game. Okay. So that's how that was researched. That's how that subject was researched, by those kind of things. And that was, and the lower end, at least the lower end of the bridge, was researched with other auditors, and it did have more applicability broadly. But the upper level stuff, that was all him taking himself into session and coming out with that directly. This is what we're going to do. Well, John didn't neither research Idenics that way. Everything that, all the questions, all the standard questions we got were from the people we worked with, never out of our own minds, never what we thought would be a good question. So there basically, there was always two types of questions in Idenics. There's what we call a standard question, okay, which is a question that it's been there a majority of the time, so you're likely to get a good response to it. So it's one that you can then give to other practitioners and train them on. There's also what we call the special question, which is in response to what the client just said to you. Those are going to work 100% of the time because the guy just handed it to you on a silver platter. You know, for instance, you would say, you ask a guy, well, so-and-so, and the guy goes, well, it's not really that. It's more like this. And you turn around and just give him that same question. You think it's going to work? Of course it's going to work. The guy just handed it to you, right? So in the beginning, John didn't have very many standard questions, right? So he couldn't really train people. Everything he was doing was listening to the guy because he didn't have this thing in his head.
So how did you get training materials then?
So what the way he would, it was kind of like this. Every once in a while, a special question would, what he used to call, perk up my ears, which meant that he thought it might be broadly applicable. So he would make a note of it. And in another situation where it seemed appropriate, he would ask it. Well, 9 times out of 10, as he used to say, it was what he called a dead duck, meaning it was only applicable to one guy and he'd throw it away. But every once in a while, he'd come up with what he called a jewel. And that was a question that was broadly applicable, right? So he put enough, once he had enough of the basic stuff together, the basic idea, and what that was in the beginning, mechanically, was basically how these identities get started and generated in the beginning, and that sort of thing, stuff that he'd been kind of fooling with since the 50s, that all kind of came together. So we were at that point, once he kind of had that basic idea and we had enough questions, then he could train other people. So we had, once we started doing this, a lot of our auditors left because they just wanted to still do Scientology, and I wouldn't deliver the bridge anymore at that point. People came to me, I can't do that anymore. So either they went with some of these guys or I sent them to somebody else, you know, which was a tough time financially, but I wasn't going to deliver something that I when we could do this, right? And so, but a few of those auditors stuck around, and John trained them, those guys, and then we went and then I would set up things like in Miami, and I would go down there and take everybody with me. The problem was that at this time, with these things, these guys could not get the same results as John, even though they had these mechanics, what I call mechanics. Mechanics are the processes, the questions, and the concepts of which those are based on. That's what I call mechanics. We had these mechanics, and we trained them in them. And these were experienced auditors, but they couldn't get the same results. So they would revert back to Scientology. They would revert back to just doing something else on the guy. And then finally I just, they either quit or I let them go. So there was finally it was just John and I and Bill Potter, who was doing admin for me. But that was it. And we had to, it was a very tough time financially. We had to move out of the place, move back into the house, couldn't afford it. But it was just, at that time, it was like, why? And that's when we came up with, and it's, I called it, I did a write-up back in around 2002 or something, that was picked up in archive, where I talked about the beginnings of Idenics and how it was researched, developed, things I'm talking about now. And it was on a website, freezoneplanet.org, where a person could read all these. But one of the section, one of the little articles talking about it, I called it John's Secret, right? Well, it really wasn't something he was keeping a secret. It was something he never spotted in himself, because it was just something he did. And it was like so natural to him. He was always able to do, he always did this. And it was things other people recognized, but they never put their finger on. Like Hubbard recognized it. He would always leave John alone, let him go do what he wants, stuff like that. And it was like when I mentioned when we were down, when he was doing we did that book one event down at Flag, and the class 12s had come down to watch him audit. And they were saying, did you learn some kind of special TRs from him? He's going, I don't know what you're talking about. People spotted that there was something different about the guy. Well, but he never knew what it was, because it was just like, to him, it was as natural as breathing. You know, it was like what he was doing. It was, and it was like, I was pretty good at evaluating, and I was doing the work and doing this auditing too, the Idenics also. And I was able to kind of spot it. I wrote the first issue on it. It had to do with the application, the non-judgmental application. In other words, without that, if you were even figuring this stuff in your head, what you're going to do. In other words, like these other practitioners, they still had all this figure going on in their heads about the guy, what they're going to do with it. They couldn't hear the special question. That's why they couldn't get the results. They couldn't hear it. It would just, they'd be thinking about what they're going to do with the guy. They couldn't hear everything the guy says. And it was the same for me when I first started. I would get stuff popping up in my head while I'm working with somebody, but it got to a point where I'd notice it. I'd see that I was doing that, and I would just notice, okay, that's my crap. That has nothing to do with the guy. And then just keep going in the session. And that's what I had to do at first, because John just was like that. I don't know. But, and after a while, pretty soon, I noticed that stuff didn't pop up anymore. Just noticing it each time it popped up. And just acknowledging it, for myself, taking credit. Okay, good, that's my crap. And I'll just keep doing the session. And after a while, it didn't pop up anymore. And then I could really hear everything, if that makes sense.
So did you was it just you and John then for a long time before you could figure out how to get the materials together?
Right. And then we had some other practitioners that we had working for us that we trained. And eventually, this was 1986, 87. And finally, we had enough standard questions. He had enough stuff put together where we could train people. And in
would you train people like in a course room type atmosphere, as opposed to have them reading a pack of materials like we did in Scientology and then doing?
Well, when we started the first course we delivered, we had like a pack of materials. Obviously, we had a pack of materials that the person studied, and we went over with them. And John would go over with them, and they would read through it, this sort of thing, and then go over it and drill it and that sort of thing. Same thing. So they were comfortable with the procedures. But the first course we delivered was like a lecture series. It was live. And we had so many people come in, and John would give the lectures. And he had a small, we didn't have a lot of materials, but he'd give them the pack, and he would give a lecture, and then they'd go off and work together, that sort of thing. And I remember him, and the way he would train. I remember all these guys in the original training were all people who'd been in Scientology. And I remember when he was doing it, he told them, he says, what I want you to do is now take that materials and go off and discuss this amongst yourself. They go, what are you talking about? Discuss it. What do you mean we can discuss it? Well, sure. How are you going to make the material yours and understand it if you can't discuss it and question it? Because they're all used to just do what your materials state.
Right. Where's your misunderstood word?
They're just kind of like, but that's the way he trained for Hubbard when they did it in the early days. All that other stuff came later about, this is it. You can't talk, you can't discuss it, and you can't question, well, baloney, do that. How are you going to learn it? So that's how we did our first training, right? But we videotaped them all on VHS. We had all those. I had a video and I videoed all those lectures. So this way, we now had 10 hours worth of videotapes of lectures of John. So then people would come and do the training. They had the pack, plus they had the videos that they could watch and go through. And they go through this stuff, and then John would work with them with questions individually. And we did that for a while until there was so much stuff to him to go, new stuff, that we ended up doing a second course where we did a new set of videotape, a new people, and where we had other people because he was spending too much time going over it, with them. So then we did a new, and then we did a third one, which was of videotapes, which was later on, which is about a year before he passed away, where it was just, we didn't have a lot of people like the ones before, because one of the problems is you'd have people come in and a lot of the questions they would ask weren't necessarily ones you'd want on the videotapes. So if you had like ex-Scientologists, they're asking these questions that have to do with Scientology, I don't want that stuff on the tapes. So I'd have to say to them, okay, if you have questions about Scientology, mention that afterwards. Don't mention it in here. But it finally got to where we did the last one, and I knew all the questions people asked, so I just did it. It was just the two of us, and I was the audience, and I asked the questions, and John, and then we had other things in there like we do demonstration sessions and live sessions of him working with people and stuff. That was all part of it too.
That's great.
Okay. But that was pretty much how we did the course. But in those days, that was how it began.
Okay, great. Well, this is a good point to go on to the next one. I want to ask you more about the results and all that. But in the meantime, sure. I just wanted to mention, this is your book, Idenics, An Alternative to Therapy by Mike Goldstein. It's very simple. I have it here. I read it. It's very easy to read. It's got a glossary in the back and all that. So anyway, and then I wanted to mention too that you've got, if they want to find out more about Idenics, you've got your website, www.idenics.com, right?
Right. And is that where people can get your book from?
Yeah, they can get it from there. You can also get it on Amazon.
Okay.
Okay.
But you can get it from us, which is better than Amazon.
Yeah, and then your website, I briefly looked at it because it just had it here, but it goes into lots of different of what your services deliver and things like that.
Right.
Success stories, things like that on there. So if people are interested in finding out more about it, you can go to that website, www.idenics.com.
Right. There's articles and there's also some audio tape. There's a great one. If you want to, is an interview that I did with John Galusha called What I Do. It's called What I Do. It's fantastic.
There's one I'll listen to it before our next show because I'd like to hear what John Galusha sounds like.
That's a great, wonderful thing. There's another one up there with Billy interviewing me, but I don't know that you don't mainly just listen to the John Galusha. That's the main one.
Okay, great. Without further ado, I wanted to mention our Outback Natural, Janice's company, complete liquid multivitamins. They're available. Just go down below in our description, click on the link, and you can get your daily supply of multivitamins in a liquid form, peach flavored, refrigerated, 2 tablespoons, or I use a little shot glass, and it's really good, right, Janice?
Yeah, it is. And Mark, your little ads are working. I mean, I'm starting to get orders in from our viewers. So that's nice.
Right. That's right. Yeah, no. So I definitely highly recommend it. If you're sick of taking, a handful of pills, this is the easy way to do it, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's like I said, you can get it down below at our. Just click on our merchandise store, or also then go to Vites.com, right, Janice?
Yeah, VITES.com.
Great. Fantastic. And then also I wanted to mention, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification button, and what do they do? Rock slam the like button.
That's
do
right.
that. And, we appreciate that, and you'll get notified whenever the next videos come up or anything like that. And if you've got any questions or comments about what we talked about today, go down below. Mike reads them all. If you've got questions about, different theories and things like that, I'm sure he'd be happy to go into them. So just go down in the question comment section. And if you'd also like to support our channel, you can buy us a coffee in the video description. Click on the link there, and that just helps us continue to put out videos and basically takes care of the expenses that we incur. Anyway, have you guys got anything else you want to say before we end off this video today?
Nope. Thank you, Mike, and sorry for the
Thank
delay
you.
from my mic not working.
No problem. It gave Mark and I a chance to chat.
Catch up, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, everybody. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.